I didn't believe the stories about Centralia until I saw him standing in the smoke. My brother Jake and I made the drive on a cold February afternoon, the kind where the sky hangs low and gray and the whole world feels like it's holding its breath. We were both home from college for the weekend, bored out of our minds. And when Jake suggested we check out Centralia, I didn't put up much of a fight. We'd heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Pennsylvania knows about Centralia, the town that's been burning from below for over 60 years. An underground coal fire that never went out, slowly consuming everything, forcing people to abandon their homes and leave behind a ghost town where steam rises from cracks in the earth, like something out of a nightmare. It sounded like the perfect way to kill a Saturday afternoon. The drive took us through winding back roads, past bare trees and farmland that looked like it had been forgotten by time. Jake was driving, one hand on the wheel, the other holding his phone, as he read aloud from some blog about Centralia. "Says here the fire could burn for another 200 years, he said, grinning. And there's only like 5 people still living there, stubborn old-timers who refuse to leave. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur past. Why would anyone stay? I don't know, man. Pride, I guess. Or maybe they're just crazy. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. Either way, it's creepy as hell, perfect for us. When we finally pulled into Centralia, the first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, like the air itself has been muffled. The streets were cracked and buckled, split apart by decades of heat and shifting earth. Steam rose from fissures in the asphalt, curling upward in thin white tendrils that disappeared into the gray sky. A few buildings still stood, skeletal remains of houses and storefronts, their windows dark and empty. Most of the town had been demolished years ago, leaving behind nothing but foundations and overgrown lots. We parked near the old church, one of the few structures still standing. It was small and weathered, the white paint peeling away in long strips. The door was boarded up, and graffiti covered the lower half of the walls. Jake killed the engine, and we sat there for a moment, just taking it in. "All right," he said, grabbing his camera from the back seat. "Let's do this." We got out and started walking. The ground was warm beneath our feet, even through our shoes. I could feel the heat radiating up from the pavement, a reminder that somewhere deep below us, the fire was still burning. The air smelled faintly of sulfur and smoke, sharp and acrid in the back of my throat. Jake was already snapping pictures, grinning like a kid on Christmas morning. "This is insane," he said, crouching down to photograph one of the larger cracks in the road. Steam billowed out, and he waved it away, laughing. "Dude, you can literally see the heat." I nodded, but I wasn't paying attention to him. Something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the longer we stayed, the more uneasy I became. It was too quiet, no birds, no wind, just the faint hiss of steam and the sound of our footsteps echoing off the empty buildings. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the end of the street, maybe 50 yards away, near where the road collapsed into a sinkhole. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by one of the ruined buildings. But then I realized he wasn't moving. He was just standing there, perfectly still, facing us. He was wearing old miner's clothes, dark pants, a heavy work shirt, and a cap pulled low over his face. His arms hung at his sides, and his posture was rigid, almost unnaturally so. Even from a distance, I could tell something was wrong. It was freezing out, cold enough that our breath came out in visible puffs, but I couldn't see any sign of breath coming from him. "Jake," I said, my voice low. "Do you see that?" He looked up from his camera, following my gaze. "See what?" "That guy, down the street." Jake squinted, shielding his eyes from the glare of the overcast sky. "Oh yeah, probably just some local messing with us. Or maybe it's a mannequin or something. People leave weird shit out here all the time." I wanted to believe him, but something about the figure made my skin crawl. I called out, raising my hand in a tentative wave. "Hey, you okay?" No response. He didn't move, didn't even turn his head. Jake laughed nervously. "Yeah, definitely a mannequin. Come on, let's get closer. I want a picture." I didn't want to get closer, but I wasn't about to admit that to my brother. So I followed him as he started walking toward the figure, camera in hand. The closer we got, the more details I could make out. The man's clothes were old-like, genuinely old, not costume old. They were worn and stained, the fabric faded from years of use. His face was still shadowed by the cap, but I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the pale skin that looked almost gray in the dim light. We stopped about 20 feet away. Jake raised his camera and snapped a photo. The click of the shutter echoed in the silence, sharp and intrusive. "All right, dude," Jake said, lowering the camera. "You got us. Very funny. But seriously, you're kind of freaking us out." Still nothing. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe. "Let's go," I said, tugging on Jake's sleeve. "This is weird." Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, okay. This place is giving me the creeps anyway." We turned and started walking back toward the car. I glanced over my shoulder once, just to see if the figure was still there. He was. Same spot, same position, arms at his sides, staring after us. But then something changed. We hadn't gone more than 10 steps when I looked back again. He was closer, not by much, maybe 5 or 6 feet, but definitely closer than he'd been before. And I hadn't heard him move. No footsteps, no rustling of fabric, nothing. "Jake," I said, my voice tight, "he's following us." Jake turned, and I saw the color drain from his face. "What the hell?" We started walking faster, not quite running, but close. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't help myself. Every time I turned my head, he was closer. Not walking, not running, just closer, like the space between us was shrinking on its own. "Run," Jake said, and we bolted. We sprinted down the cracked street, our footsteps pounding against the asphalt. I could hear Jake's ragged breathing beside me, could feel my own heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare look back until we reached the car. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and I turned to see where the figure was. He was standing in the middle of the road, maybe 30 feet away, arms at his sides, perfectly still, watching us. Jake finally got the door open, and we threw ourselves inside. He jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. We peeled out, the tires screeching against the pavement, and I looked back one last time. He was still there, standing in the road, watching. We didn't talk on the drive home. Jake's hands were white-knuckled on the wheel, and I kept my eyes on the side mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the road behind us. But there was nothing, just empty highway and gray sky. When we got home, Jake went straight to his computer to upload the photos from his camera. I stood behind him, watching as the images loaded onto the screen. The first few were normal shots of the church, the cracked streets, the steam rising from the ground. But then I saw it. In the background of every single photo, there he was. The figure in miner's clothes, always in the background, always watching. And in every shot, he was closer. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, clicking through the images. How did I not see him? I leaned in, my stomach twisting. In the first photo, he was far away, barely visible at the edge of the frame. In the second, he was closer. In the third, closer still. By the 10th photo, he was standing just a few feet behind Jake, his face still shadowed by the cap. And then we got to the last photo, the one Jake had taken from inside the car, just as we were pulling away. The figure was standing directly behind my seat, his face pressed against the rear window, and for the first time, I could see his eyes. They were black, completely black, no whites, no pupils, just endless, empty darkness. Jake slammed the laptop shut and stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "We're deleting these, all of them." "Yeah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Good idea." But even after we deleted the photos, even after we swore we'd never talk about Centralia again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us home. It started small. A faint smell of sulfur in my dorm room, so faint I thought I was imagining it. The sensation of being watched when I was alone. And then, one night, I woke up at 3 in the morning to the smell of burning coal. It was so strong it made my eyes water, and when I sat up in bed, I saw him. He was standing in the corner of my room, half hidden in shadow, arms at his sides, watching me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I just sat there, staring at him, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. And then, slowly, he raised one hand and pointed at me. I blinked, and he was gone. I called Jake the next morning. He sounded exhausted, like he hadn't slept in days. "I've been seeing him too," he admitted. "Every night, just standing there, watching. We don't talk about it anymore. We don't go back to Centralia. We don't even drive through Pennsylvania if we can help it. But sometimes, late at night, I smell sulfur and burning coal, and I know deep down that he's still there, still watching, still waiting, and I don't think he's ever going to stop. I should have known better than to go to Concrete City alone, but I'd done plenty of urban exploration before and never had a problem. It was supposed to be simple, a handful of abandoned worker housing units in Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, left over from some coal company's failed experiment in the early 1900s. The place had been empty for decades, just concrete shells covered in graffiti, slowly crumbling back into the earth. I'd seen the photos online. It looked interesting, a little eerie maybe, but nothing I couldn't handle. I should have turned around the moment I got there. It was a Sunday afternoon in late October, the kind of day where the sun hangs low and weak in the sky, casting everything in shades of gray and brown. The air was cold and damp, smelling faintly of rotting leaves and old concrete. I parked on the side of the road and hiked up the overgrown path that led to the complex. The buildings appeared through the trees like broken teeth, two long rows of identical concrete structures, each one a mirror image of the next. They were ugly and brutalist, with narrow windows and flat roofs, built to house workers as cheaply as possible. Most of the windows were broken now, the interiors gutted and exposed to the elements. I stood at the edge of the clearing and looked around. The place was completely silent. No birds, no wind, just the faint rustling of dead leaves and the distant hum of traffic from the highway. I pulled out my camera and started taking pictures, walking slowly between the buildings. The graffiti was everywhere, tags and symbols and crude drawings spray-painted across the concrete. Some of it was fresh, but most of it looked old, faded by years of rain and sun. I was about halfway through the complex when I stepped into the central courtyard. It was a small open space between the two rows of buildings, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken glass and chunks of concrete. I stood there for a moment, just listening, and that's when I heard it. Children laughing. It was faint at first, almost like I was imagining it. A soft, echoing sound that seemed to come from somewhere inside one of the buildings. I froze, straining to hear. The laughter came again, clearer, this time high-pitched and playful, like kids playing tag or hide-and-seek. I told myself it was probably just teenagers messing around, trying to scare anyone who wandered in. It wouldn't be the first time, but something about the sound made my skin crawl. I walked toward the building where the laughter seemed to be coming from, my camera hanging forgotten around my neck. The entrance was a gaping black rectangle, the door long since torn away. I hesitated at the threshold, peering into the darkness. The laughter echoed again, deeper inside, and I convinced myself that if it really was just kids, I should probably check it out, make sure they weren't doing anything stupid. I stepped inside. The interior was dim and cold, the walls covered in layers of graffiti and mold. The hallway stretched straight ahead, lined with doorways that led to empty rooms on either side. The floor was littered with debris, broken glass, chunks of plaster, rusted metal scraps. I moved slowly, my footsteps crunching on the glass, and the laughter echoed again somewhere ahead of me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small and hollow in the enclosed space. "Anyone there?" The laughter stopped. I stood there in the silence, waiting, my heart beating a little faster than before. Maybe they'd heard me and run off. Maybe they were hiding, waiting to jump out and scare me. I took another step forward, and that's when I heard it. My name. It was a whisper, soft and clear, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead. "Daniel." I froze. No one knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. I just decided to make the trip on a whim that morning. "Hello?" I said again, my voice shakier this time. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, closer now. "Daniel." And then another voice joined it, and another. Within seconds, there were dozens of voices, all whispering my name in unison, overlapping and echoing off the concrete walls. They were all around me, ahead, behind, to the sides, coming from every direction at once. I turned and ran. I bolted back down the hallway toward the entrance, my feet slipping on the debris, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But the hallway looked different now, longer. The doorways seemed to multiply, stretching on in both directions, and I couldn't remember which way I'd come in. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic, a chorus of voices all saying my name over and over. I ducked through one of the doorways, thinking maybe I could cut through to another hallway. But the room was empty and dark, with no other exit. I turned back, but the hallway had changed again. The doorways were in different places. The walls seemed to shift and bend in the dim light. I ran again, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I passed room after room, hallway after hallway, and none of it made sense. The building wasn't that big. I should have found the exit by now. But every time I thought I was getting close, the hallway would stretch out again, pulling the exit further away. The whispers were deafening now, so loud I couldn't hear my own footsteps. I covered my ears and kept running, tears streaming down my face, my lungs burning. And then, finally, I saw it, a rectangle of gray light ahead. The exit. I burst through the doorway and stumbled into the open air, gasping and shaking. But something was wrong. I wasn't in the courtyard anymore. I was on the opposite end of the complex, near the far edge where the buildings bordered the woods. I turned in a circle, trying to get my bearings, and realized I had no idea how I'd gotten here. I reached for my phone to call for help, but it was dead. Completely dead, even though I'd charged it that morning. I shoved it back in my pocket and started walking, heading in what I thought was the direction of my car. But when I got back to the road, my car was gone. I stood there, staring at the empty space where I'd parked, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The car had been there, I was sure of it. I'd locked it and checked twice before heading up to the complex. I looked around, half expecting to see someone driving away with it, but the road was empty. No cars, no people, nothing. I had no choice but to walk. The nearest town was about 2 miles back the way I'd come, and I didn't have any other options. I started walking, glancing over my shoulder every few steps, half convinced I'd see someone following me. But the road stayed empty, and the only sound was the crunch of my shoes on the gravel. By the time I made it back to town, the sun was setting, and my legs felt like they were going to give out. I found a gas station and used the payphone to call my friend Eric. He sounded confused when I explained what had happened, but he agreed to drive out and help me look for the car. We went back together the next morning. I was exhausted and jittery, barely able to sleep the night before, but I needed to know what had happened. Eric drove us out to Concrete City, and when we pulled up to the spot where I'd parked the day before, my car was there, right where I'd left it. "Dude," Eric said, looking at me like I was losing my mind, "are you sure you didn't just forget where you parked?" I didn't answer. I just stared at the car, my stomach twisting into knots. I walked over and opened the driver's side door. The seat was soaked, completely drenched, like someone had poured a bucket of water on it. I touched the fabric. It was cold and wet, smelling faintly of mildew. "What the hell?" Eric muttered, leaning over to look. "Did you leave a window open or something?" I shook my head. The windows were all closed, locked even. Eric wanted to leave, and I didn't argue. I grabbed my camera from the passenger seat, thankfully. It was still there, and we drove back to town in silence. I didn't tell him about the voices, or the hallway, or the way the building had seemed to shift around me. I didn't think he'd believe me. It wasn't until later that night, when I was alone in my apartment, that I decided to check the footage on my camera. I'd been recording on and off during the exploration, and I thought maybe I'd caught something that would explain what had happened. I plugged the camera into my laptop and started going through the files. The first few videos were normal shots of the exterior, the graffiti, the empty rooms. But then I got to the last file, and my blood ran cold. The timestamp said it was over 3 hours long. I didn't remember recording for 3 hours. I'd been in the building for maybe 20 minutes, tops, before I ran out. But the video kept playing, and I watched in growing horror as the footage showed me standing in one of the hallways, perfectly still, staring at the camera. I wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just standing there, the camera pointed at my own face. And I was smiling, not a normal smile. It was too wide, too fixed, like someone had carved it into my face. My eyes were empty, unfocused, staring at nothing. The whispers were there too, faint but audible in the background, saying my name over and over. The video went on for hours. Me, standing in that hallway, smiling, not moving. I slammed the laptop shut and shoved it away, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold on to it. I didn't watch the rest. I didn't want to know what else was on there. I never went back to Concrete City. I deleted the footage, threw the camera in a drawer, and tried to forget the whole thing ever happened. But I can't, because sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it. Whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable, and they're saying my name. I never believed in ghosts until I went to pick up my girlfriend from work at Eckley Miners Village. She'd been working there for about 6 months as a historical interpreter, giving tours to school groups and tourists, dressed in period clothing, and talking about what life was like for coal miners in the 1800s. It was a decent gig for her, quiet, predictable, and she got to spend her days surrounded by history. She loved that kind of thing. It was mid-January, one of those bitter cold evenings where the sun sets early and the darkness feels heavier than it should. Sarah had asked me to pick her up after closing because her car was in the shop, and I'd agreed without thinking much of it. I left work around 4:30 and made the drive out to Eckley, arriving about 20 minutes early. The village sat in a valley between low hills, a collection of weathered wooden houses and buildings arranged along a dirt road. It looked like it had been frozen in time, no power lines, no modern structures, just the skeletal remains of a company town that had been abandoned decades ago and preserved as a museum. I parked near the company store, a 2-story wooden building that served as the main visitor center. The lot was empty except for Sarah's supervisor's truck, which meant everyone else had already left for the day. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, watching the last light drain from the sky. The village looked different in the dying light, lonelier, somehow. The houses stood silent and dark, their windows like empty eye sockets staring out at nothing. I checked my phone. Still 15 minutes until Sarah would be done. I decided to get out and stretch my legs rather than sit in the car freezing. The cold hit me the moment I opened the door, sharp and biting, cutting through my jacket like it wasn't even there. I walked over to the company store and leaned against the wall, pulling my collar up around my neck and shoving my hands deep in my pockets. That's when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the wooden wall beside me. I turned my head, expecting to see Sarah or her supervisor coming around the corner, but there was no one there. The knocking had come from right next to me. I'd felt the vibration through the wall, but I was alone. I stepped away from the building and looked around. The dirt road was empty. The houses stood silent and still. I told myself it was just the wood settling in the cold. Old buildings made noise all the time, nothing to worry about. But then the knocking came again. This time it was coming from inside the company store, muffled but distinct. 3 deliberate knocks, evenly spaced, like someone rapping their knuckles against wood. I walked over to the door and peered through the glass. The interior was dark, the exhibits and displays reduced to shadowy shapes in the dim light. I couldn't see anyone moving inside. I pulled out my phone to text Sarah, but before I could type anything, the knocking started again. Not from the store this time, from across the dirt road, in one of the miners' houses. 3 knocks, slow, deliberate. I looked up at the house. It was a small, single-story structure with a sagging porch and narrow windows. The door was closed, and I couldn't see any movement inside. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent again. Just the wind moving through the bare trees and the distant sound of traffic from the highway. Then the knocking came from behind me. I spun around, my heart suddenly hammering in my chest. The sound was coming from beneath the porch of the company store, like someone was knocking on the underside of the floorboards. I backed away slowly, my breath coming out in visible puffs in the cold air. The knocking stopped, and that's when I saw him. There was a figure standing in the window of one of the miners' houses, about 30 yards down the dirt road. A man in dark work clothes, standing perfectly still, staring directly at me. I couldn't make out his face in the dim light, but I could see the shape of him: broad shoulders, arms hanging at his sides, motionless. I raised my hand in a tentative wave, thinking maybe it was a maintenance worker or someone from the historical society. But the figure didn't move, didn't wave back, just stood there, staring. Something about it felt wrong. The air had changed, grown colder, heavier. I could feel it pressing against my chest, making it harder to breathe. I took a step toward the house, then another, my feet crunching on the frozen dirt. The figure in the window didn't move. I don't know why I kept walking. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the stubborn part of me that didn't want to believe what I was feeling. But the closer I got to that house, the worse it became. The cold seemed to intensify with every step, seeping into my bones and making my muscles ache. The air smelled wrong, too damp and earthy, like the inside of a mine shaft. I stopped about 10 feet from the porch. The figure was still in the window, and now I could see more details. His clothes were old, genuinely old, not costume old, stained and worn, the fabric faded and threadbare. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but I could see his eyes. They were dark and hollow, fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The knocking started again. This time it was coming from beneath my feet, from somewhere deep in the frozen ground. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and the knocking stopped. The figure in the window tilted his head slightly, like he was curious about something, or amused. I turned and walked quickly back toward the company store. Not quite running, but close. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The cold followed me, clinging to my skin, and I could still hear the knocking in my head even though it had stopped. When I reached the store, I pounded on the door with my fist. "Sarah, let me in." A few seconds later, the lock clicked and the door swung open. Sarah stood there, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide. "Did you hear it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" "The knocking." I stared at her. "You heard it too?" She nodded, glancing over her shoulder into the dark interior of the store. "It started about 10 minutes ago, coming from the walls, the floor, everywhere. I thought maybe it was you outside, but..." She trailed off, looking past me toward the village. "What were you doing over there?" "There was someone in one of the houses," I said, my voice shaking. "A man, in the window, just standing there, staring at me." Sarah's expression changed, hardening into something between fear and resignation. "We need to leave, now." She grabbed her coat and bag, and we hurried to the car. I started the engine and pulled out of the lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Sarah sat beside me, staring straight ahead, her jaw clenched. We didn't talk until we were back on the highway, the lights of the village disappearing behind us. "What the hell was that?" I finally asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then sighed. "The night guard told me about it once. He said it happens every few months. The knocking. He calls it the miners coming back." "Coming back from where?" "I don't know. He wouldn't really explain it. Just said that when you hear the knocking, you don't answer. You don't acknowledge it. And you definitely don't let them in." She turned to look at me, her eyes dark and serious. "He said if you let them in, you don't leave the same." "What does that mean?" "I don't know, and I don't want to find out." I wanted to press her for more, to demand answers. But I could tell she was scared, really scared. And honestly, so was I. We drove the rest of the way in silence, and when I dropped her off at her apartment, she kissed me quickly and told me to be careful driving home. I should have left it alone. I should have forgotten about the whole thing and moved on with my life, but I couldn't. The knocking stayed with me, echoing in the back of my mind, and I kept thinking about the figure in the window, the way he'd stared at me, the way the air had changed when I got close to the house. A few days later, I went back to Eckley. It was a Saturday morning, and the village was open to the public. I walked around, looking at the exhibits, pretending to be a normal tourist, but I kept gravitating toward the house where I'd seen the figure. It looked different in the daylight, smaller, less menacing, just an old wooden building with sagging shutters and peeling paint. I asked one of the guides about the house, trying to sound casual. She told me it had been the home of a miner named Thomas Brennan and his family. He'd died in a cave-in back in 1881, along with 6 other men. They'd been trapped underground for 3 days before the rescue crews gave up. The bodies were never recovered. "People say they still hear the knocking sometimes," the guide said, smiling like it was a fun piece of local folklore. "The miners, trying to signal for help. It's just a story, of course." I thanked her and left, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a story. I'd heard the knocking. I'd felt the cold. I'd seen the figure in the window, and whatever it was, it had been real. Sarah quit her job at Eckley a few weeks later. She said she couldn't handle the isolation, the long winter evenings alone in the village. But I think we both knew the real reason. She'd heard the knocking too, and it had scared her more than she wanted to admit. I still think about that night sometimes, about the figure in the window and the knocking that came from beneath the ground. I wonder what would have happened if I'd walked onto that porch, if I'd knocked back, if I'd let them in. The night guard said you don't leave the same, and I believe him. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, coming from the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And I know deep down that they're still looking for a way in. And someday, I'm afraid I might answer. I've been a photographer for almost 15 years, specializing in abandoned places and forgotten history. I've been to ghost towns all over the country, from the dusty remnants of mining camps in Nevada to the crumbling plantation houses of the Deep South. I thought I'd seen it all. But Pithole City in Pennsylvania was different. It wasn't just abandoned, it felt erased, like the earth itself was trying to forget it had ever existed. Pithole was a boom town in the 1860s, built almost overnight when oil was discovered in the area. At its peak, it had 15,000 people, dozens of hotels, theaters, newspapers, even a fire department. They called it the city of the future, but the oil ran out fast, and within 2 years, everyone was gone. The buildings were torn down or burned, and the land was left to return to wilderness. Now, all that's left are a few rotting foundations, some rusted plaques marking where buildings used to stand, and fields of tall grass where streets once ran. I'd wanted to photograph Pithole for years, to capture what little remained before it disappeared completely. I drove out there on a crisp afternoon in late September, when the leaves were just starting to turn and the air had that sharp, clean smell of approaching autumn. The site was managed by the state as a historical park, but there wasn't much to manage, just a small parking area, a couple of informational signs, and a walking trail that wound through the fields. I was the only one there. No other cars in the lot, no tourists wandering the paths, just me and the wind moving through the grass. I grabbed my camera bag and started walking, following the trail markers through what used to be the heart of the city. The plaques told the story. Here was the Bonte Hotel, here was the Chase Opera House, here was the Presbyterian Church. But all I could see were shallow depressions in the ground and a few scattered foundation stones half buried in the dirt. I spent the afternoon taking photographs, trying to capture the eerie emptiness of the place, the way the light fell across the fields, the rusted metal of the historical markers, the way the forest had reclaimed everything, leaving barely a trace that thousands of people had once lived and worked here. It was beautiful in a melancholy sort of way, and I lost myself in the work, moving from site to site, checking my light meter, adjusting my settings. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon when I made my way to the old well site. It was one of the original oil wells that had sparked the boom, now just a concrete cap surrounded by a low metal fence. I was composing a shot of the well against the golden light of the setting sun when I noticed her. She was standing about 30 yards away, near the edge of the tree line, watching me. At first, I thought she was another photographer, or maybe a park employee, but as I looked closer, I realized something was off. She was wearing a long dress, dark fabric, high collar, full skirt, the kind of thing women wore in the 1860s. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she stood perfectly still, her hands clasped in front of her. I lowered my camera and waved. She didn't wave back, but she smiled. It was a small, gentle smile, the kind you'd give to a stranger you passed on the street. I assumed she was a historical reenactor, maybe part of some event I hadn't heard about. There were sometimes living history demonstrations at sites like this. I walked toward her, raising my voice to carry across the distance. "Excuse me, are you with the park? I'm just taking some photographs. I hope that's okay." She didn't respond, just stood there, smiling, watching me approach. When I was about 15 feet away, I raised my camera to ask if I could photograph her. She was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with sharp features and pale skin that seemed to glow in the fading light. But the moment I brought the camera up to my eye, she stepped backward into the trees. "Wait," I called out, thinking maybe she was camera shy or didn't want her picture taken. "I'm sorry, I should have asked first." I lowered the camera and followed her into the woods, pushing through the undergrowth. The tree line was thicker than I'd expected, the branches close together and draped with dying vines. I could see her ahead of me, moving between the trees with an easy grace, her dark dress somehow never catching on the branches that scratched at my jacket and jeans. "Hey," I called again. "I didn't mean to bother you. I was just curious about your outfit. Are you part of a reenactment group?" She didn't answer, didn't even turn around. She just kept moving deeper into the woods, always staying just ahead of me, always visible but just out of reach. I followed, telling myself I'd just ask her one quick question and then head back. But the woods seemed to go on forever, much deeper than they'd looked from the field. I started to feel uneasy. The light was fading fast, and I was getting farther and farther from the trail. I couldn't hear the wind in the grass anymore, just my own footsteps crunching through the undergrowth and the occasional snap of a twig. The woman moved silently, her feet making no sound at all. "Look, I'm heading back now," I said. stopping. "I'm sorry if I bothered you." She stopped too, about 20 feet ahead of me, and turned to face me. She was still smiling, but in the dimming light, I couldn't quite make out her features anymore. She raised one hand and beckoned to me, a slow, deliberate gesture. Something about that gesture made my blood run cold. I don't know why it was perfectly innocent, just a simple wave, but everything in my body told me to turn around and walk away. So I did. I turned and started walking back the way I'd come, moving as quickly as I could without running. The woods seemed different now, darker and more tangled. I couldn't find the path I'd taken in. The trees all looked the same, and I kept thinking I was going in circles. I pulled out my phone to use the compass app, but there was no signal, and the battery was nearly dead, even though I'd charged it that morning. I walked for what felt like an hour, pushing through brambles and climbing over fallen logs, my camera bag banging against my hip. My heart was pounding, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see the woman in the dark dress following me. But I was alone. The woods were completely silent, except for my own ragged breathing. Just when I was starting to panic, convinced I'd gotten myself hopelessly lost, I broke through a thick patch of undergrowth and stumbled back onto the main trail. I stood there for a moment, dizzy with relief, my hands shaking. The parking lot was visible in the distance, my car a small shape in the gathering darkness. I practically ran back to the car, threw my camera bag in the passenger seat, and drove away without looking back. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, miles away from Pithole, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of those woods. It wasn't until I got home that night that I decided to look through the photos I'd taken. I transferred them to my computer and started scrolling through, looking at the shots of the fields and foundations and the old well site. And that's when I saw her. She was in the first photo I'd taken that day, a wide shot of the walking trail stretching through the grass. She was barely visible, just a small dark figure standing at the far edge of the frame, near the tree line. I hadn't noticed her when I took the photo. I'd been completely alone. I scrolled to the next photo. She was closer, standing near one of the foundation markers. Then closer still in the next one, positioned behind a rusted plaque. In every single photograph, she was there, always in the background, always watching. Getting closer with each shot, my hands started to shake as I clicked through the images. In the photos I'd taken at the well site, she was standing just a few yards away from me, partially hidden by the metal fence. I hadn't seen her there. I would have noticed. And then I got to the last photo, the one I'd taken just before I left, a final shot of the field at sunset. I'd been standing at the edge of the parking lot, my back to my car, trying to capture the way the light hit the grass. In the photo, she's standing directly behind me. I can see her reflection in my camera lens, distorted and warped by the curved glass. She's so close her face nearly touches the back of my head, and she's smiling that same gentle, pleasant smile. But her eyes are wrong. They're completely black, no whites, no pupils, just solid darkness that seems to absorb the light around them. I slammed the laptop shut and pushed away from the desk, my heart hammering so hard I thought I might pass out. I sat there in the dark, trying to convince myself it was a trick of the light, a strange reflection, something explainable. But I knew what I'd seen. I haven't been back to Pithole. I haven't taken any photographs since that day. My camera sits in its bag in my closet, and I can't bring myself to touch it. Because sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed trying to sleep, I hear footsteps in my apartment. Slow, deliberate footsteps, like someone walking across the floor in a long dress. And when I open my eyes, I swear I can see her standing in the corner of my room, just beyond the reach of the streetlight coming through my window. She's still smiling, still watching, and I know, with a certainty that terrifies me, that she followed me home from those woods, that she's been following me all along, from the moment I first raised my camera at Pithole City, waiting, watching, getting closer with every passing day. And someday, I'm afraid I'll wake up and she'll be standing right beside my bed, her black eyes staring down at me, her pale hand reaching out to touch my face. And when that happens, I don't think I'll be able to run anymore. My uncle inherited the house in Scotia from a distant cousin he'd barely known, and he asked me to help him clear it out before he decided whether to sell it or tear it down. I didn't know much about Scotia, except that it had been a company town back when coal was king in Pennsylvania. One of those places where the company owned everything, the houses, the store, even the church. When the mines closed in the 60s, most people left. The ones who stayed eventually died off or moved away, and now Scotia was just a handful of abandoned buildings, slowly rotting back into the hillside. We drove out there on a Saturday morning in early March, when the snow was mostly melted but the ground was still frozen and the trees were bare. The house sat at the end of a dirt road, separated from the few other remaining structures by a stretch of overgrown field. It was a small, single-story place with peeling paint and a sagging roof, the kind of house that had been built quick and cheap to pack workers in during the boom years. My uncle pulled up in front and killed the engine, and we both sat there for a moment, looking at the place. "Doesn't look like much," he said. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." We got out and walked up to the front door. My uncle had the key, an old brass thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. The lock was stiff, but it turned eventually, and the door swung open with a long creak that echoed through the empty rooms inside. The smell hit us immediately: mildew and rot, and something else underneath, something stale and old. The house was drafty, cold air seeping in through gaps in the walls and around the windows. The main floor was small, just a front room, a kitchen, and a bedroom, all of them empty, except for a few pieces of broken furniture and yellowed newspapers scattered across the floor. We spent the morning going through it, hauling trash out to my uncle's truck and making piles of anything that might be worth salvaging. It was around noon when we finished with the main floor. My uncle wiped his hands on his jeans and looked around. "There's supposed to be a cellar," he said. "We should check it out before we call it a day." I'd noticed the door earlier, set into the floor in the corner of the kitchen. It was wooden and warped with age, and when my uncle pulled it open, the smell that came up was overwhelming: rot and something metallic, like old pennies left in stagnant water. I covered my nose and stepped back, but my uncle just waved his hand in front of his face and peered down into the darkness. "Jesus," he muttered. "Place smells like something died down there." "Maybe something did," I said. "Could be a raccoon or a possum got in and couldn't get out." "Maybe." He pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. "Let's take a look." The stairs were steep and narrow, the wood soft and spongy beneath our feet. I followed my uncle down, using my own phone for light, and when we reached the bottom, I swept the beam around to get a sense of the space. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, stretching the full length of the house. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was packed dirt, damp and uneven. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck my head to avoid the floor joists. The space was packed with old furniture and crates, all of it covered in dust and cobwebs. There were chairs with broken legs, a warped dresser with the drawers hanging open, stacks of moldy boxes that fell apart when I touched them. My uncle started poking through the mess, but I found myself drawn to the far corner of the cellar, where something didn't look quite right. There was a door there, a second door, set into the stone wall. It was wooden and warped, the boards swollen with moisture, and it had no handle, just a rusty metal latch that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. "Hey," I called out to my uncle. "What's this?" He came over and shined his light on the door, frowning. "I'll be damned. That must lead to the old mine tunnels." "The mines come this far?" "Used to. A lot of these company houses had access to the tunnels from the cellars, made it easier for the workers to get to their shifts, especially in winter." He reached out and tried the latch. It was rusted solid, wouldn't budge. He pulled harder, putting his weight into it, but the door stayed shut. "Probably for the best," I said. "Those tunnels have got to be unstable as hell by now." My uncle nodded, stepping back. "Yeah, you're right. Let's just leave it alone." We spent another hour going through the cellar, but there wasn't much worth keeping, just junk and rot and the smell that seemed to get worse the longer we stayed down there. When we finally climbed back up to the kitchen, I was relieved to be out of that cramped, dark space. My uncle locked the cellar door and looked at his watch. "It's getting late. You want to crash here tonight and finish up tomorrow?" I didn't want to stay in that house, but I also didn't want to make the drive back and then have to come all the way out here again the next day, so I agreed. My uncle had brought sleeping bags and some groceries, and we set up camp in the front room, rolling out the bags on the dusty floor and eating sandwiches by the light of a battery-powered lantern. We talked for a while, mostly about nothing: work, family, my uncle's plans for the house. But eventually, the conversation died out, and we settled into our sleeping bags. The house was quiet except for the wind rattling the windows and the occasional creak of the old wood settling. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but it took a long time. The smell from the cellar seemed to have seeped into the whole house, faint but persistent, and I couldn't get comfortable on the hard floor. I must have finally dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake in complete darkness. My phone said it was 3:17 a.m. I lay there, disoriented, trying to figure out what had woken me, and then I heard it. Scraping. It was coming from below, from the cellar, a slow, rhythmic sound, like something heavy being dragged across stone. I sat up, my heart already starting to pound, and listened. The scraping continued, steady and deliberate, moving across the cellar floor. I looked over at my uncle. He was still asleep, snoring softly. I thought about waking him, but part of me didn't want to seem paranoid. It was probably just the house settling. Old places made noise. That was normal. But the scraping didn't sound normal. I got out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could and made my way to the kitchen. The cellar door was still closed, the way my uncle had left it. I stood there for a moment, listening. The scraping had stopped. The house was silent again. I knelt down and pressed my ear to the door. Nothing, just silence. I started to stand up, relieved, when I heard it. Breathing. It was coming from the other side of the door. Heavy, wet breathing, like someone with fluid in their lungs. Slow and labored, each breath rattling in their chest. I froze, my hand still on the door. My own breath caught in my throat. The breathing continued for a long moment, and then it stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling, and retreated to the front room. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I just sat there in my sleeping bag, staring at the doorway to the kitchen, waiting for the sun to come up. When morning finally came, my uncle woke up and stretched, looking rested. "Sleep okay?" he asked. I didn't know how to answer that. I didn't want to tell him about the scraping and the breathing because it sounded insane even to me. So I just nodded and said, "Yeah, fine." We packed up our sleeping bags and headed to the kitchen to make some coffee. That's when my uncle noticed the cellar door. "Did you open this?" he asked. I looked over. The door was standing open, the darkness of the cellar visible beyond. "No," I said. "You locked it last night." "I know I did." He frowned, walking over to examine the latch. "It's still locked. How the hell did it open?" I didn't have an answer. We stood there staring at the open door, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. "Let's check it out," my uncle said, pulling out his phone. "Make sure nothing fell or shifted down there." I didn't want to go back down into that cellar, but I followed him anyway. We descended the stairs slowly, the beams of our phone lights cutting through the darkness. Everything looked the same as it had the day before: the piles of junk, the old furniture, the dust-covered floor, except for one thing. The wooden door in the corner, the one that led to the mine tunnels, was open. We walked over to it slowly, and my uncle shined his light into the opening. Beyond was a narrow tunnel, the walls rough-hewn stone, the ceiling low and uneven. And there, in the dust on the tunnel floor, were marks. Dry marks. They led from the cellar into the tunnel, deep grooves in the dust, like something heavy had been pulled inside. The marks were fresh. I could see where the dust had been disturbed, piled up on the sides of the grooves. "What the hell?" my uncle whispered. I didn't say anything. I just stared at those marks, my mind racing. Something had been down here last night. Something had opened that door from the inside and dragged something or itself into the tunnel. "We're leaving," my uncle said, his voice tight. "Right now." We didn't argue. We climbed back up the stairs, grabbed our stuff, and got out of that house as fast as we could. My uncle locked the front door behind us, but his hands were shaking so badly, he could barely get the key in the lock. We drove away in silence, neither of us looking back. When we got back to town, my uncle made a few phone calls and put the house on the market as is. He didn't care what he got for it. He just wanted it gone. The house is still standing, as far as I know, but no one's bought it. No one's been back inside. And I'm fine with that, because I still think about those drag marks in the tunnel, leading away into the darkness. I think about the breathing I heard on the other side of that cellar door, and I think about what might still be down there, in those old mine tunnels, waiting in the dark. Sometimes, late at night, I wake up and I swear I can smell it, that rot and metallic smell from the cellar. And I hear it too, faint but unmistakable. The scraping, slow and rhythmic, getting closer. I've been a historian for 12 years, focusing on abandoned communities in the coal regions of Pennsylvania. I've walked through dozens of ghost towns, documented hundreds of crumbling foundations, and interviewed countless descendants of people who once called these places home. I thought I understood what abandonment meant, the slow erasure of human presence, the way nature reclaims what we leave behind. But Yellow Dog Village taught me that some places don't let go so easily. Some places remember. Yellow Dog was a company town built in the early 1900s to house miners and their families. At its peak, it had maybe 300 people living in identical wooden houses, arranged along dirt streets. There was a company store, a schoolhouse, and a small church. When the mines shut down in the 1930s during the Depression, everyone left. The buildings were torn down or collapsed over the years, and now all that remains are foundation stones scattered across a hillside and the overgrown traces of streets. I'd wanted to document Yellow Dog for a while, to create a record of what little was left before it disappeared entirely. I drove out there on an October afternoon, the kind of day where the sky is gray and heavy, and the air has that sharp smell that means winter is coming. The site was remote, accessible only by a rutted dirt road that wound through dense forest. There were no markers, no signs, nothing to indicate that a community of 300 souls had once lived here. I parked at the end of the road and hiked in, carrying my notebook, camera, and a GPS unit to map the foundations. The site was larger than I'd expected, spread across several acres of hillside. I could make out the street grid if I looked carefully, slight depressions in the earth where the roads had been, raised rectangles of stone where houses had stood. Everything was overgrown with weeds and saplings, nature patiently erasing the last evidence of human habitation. I spent hours walking the site, taking photographs and measurements, making notes about what I found. I located the remains of the company store, identified by a larger foundation and the rusted metal sign I found half buried in the dirt. I found the schoolhouse, or what I thought was the schoolhouse, near the center of the village. The church was harder to locate, but I eventually found it at the highest point of the hillside, marked by a crumbling stone wall and a few weathered wooden crosses lying in the grass. The sun was starting to sink below the hills when I made my way to what I believed was the center of the old village, a clearing where several streets would have intersected. I was taking notes about the layout when I heard it. Singing. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I might be imagining it, but as I stood there listening, it grew clearer, a hymn, sung in harmony. Multiple voices, men and women, blending together in a melody I didn't recognize, but that sounded old, traditional, the kind of hymn you might hear in a small country church. I looked around, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. My first thought was that there must be a church nearby, maybe just over the hill, and the sound was carrying in the still evening air. But I'd driven through miles of empty forest to get here. There was nothing around for miles. I started walking toward the sound, following it as best I could. The singing seemed to be coming from the center of the clearing, from the exact spot where I was standing. I stopped and listened more carefully. The voices were clearer now, louder, and I could make out individual parts, a deep bass line, soaring soprano harmonies, children's voices bright and clear. The singing was coming from beneath the ground. I knelt in the dirt and pressed my ear against the earth. The voices were unmistakable now, rising up from somewhere deep below. Men, women, children, all singing together in perfect harmony. The sound was so clear I could almost make out the words, something about grace and salvation and coming home. I felt the ground vibrate beneath my hands, a subtle tremor that seemed to pulse in time with the music. I stood up quickly, my heart pounding. This wasn't possible. There was nothing under this ground except dirt and rock, and maybe the old mine tunnels. But those would have collapsed decades ago. There couldn't be anyone down there. There couldn't be singing. But there was. The hymn continued, rising and falling, the voices weaving together in complex harmonies that made my chest ache with something I couldn't name. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time, filled with a longing so deep it felt like grief. I backed away from the center of the clearing, and that's when I noticed them. Figures. Standing at the edges of the clearing, barely visible in the fading light. They were perfectly still, arranged in a loose circle around the perimeter, and they were all facing me. I couldn't make out their features in the dim light, couldn't tell if they were men or women or children. They were just dark shapes, motionless and silent, watching. I counted 12 of them, then 15, then more, appearing at the edges of my vision like they'd been there all along and I was only now seeing them. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me kneel in the dirt while the singing rose up from beneath the ground. Every instinct I had screamed at me to run, and for once in my life, I listened. I grabbed my notebook and camera and bolted toward the trail, not caring about the equipment I left scattered on the ground. I ran through the darkening forest, branches whipping at my face, my lungs burning. I didn't look back. I couldn't. When I reached my car, I threw everything in the passenger seat and peeled out, the wheels spinning in the dirt. I drove too fast down that rutted road, the car bouncing and sliding. But I didn't slow down until I was back on the paved highway with miles between me and Yellow Dog Village. I didn't stop shaking until I got home. I went straight to bed without unpacking my gear, without eating, without doing anything except locking every door and window in my apartment. I told myself it was exhaustion, that I'd been out there too long and the isolation had gotten to me. Maybe I'd fallen asleep in the clearing and dreamed the whole thing. Maybe the singing had been wind through the trees, and the figures had been shadows in my own paranoid imagination. But the next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to look through my camera, I found something that made my blood run cold. There were the photos I'd taken during the day, foundations, street grids, the rusted sign from the company store, normal documentation, exactly what I'd intended to capture. But then I got to a photo I didn't remember taking. It showed me kneeling in the dirt in the center of the clearing, my ear pressed to the ground. The photo was taken from about 10 feet away, at an angle that suggested someone had been standing over me. But I'd been alone. I was sure of it. Except I wasn't alone in the photo. There were figures surrounding me. Dozens of them, standing in that circle at the edges of the clearing, exactly as I remembered. But in the photograph, I could see them more clearly. They were wearing old clothes, work clothes, simple dresses, children in knickers and caps. They were all looking at me, their faces pale and indistinct in the failing light. And in the foreground of the photo, half buried in the dirt just inches from where I knelt, was a hand. A human hand, fingers extended upward, reaching out of the ground toward me. The skin was gray and withered, the fingernails cracked and broken. I dropped my camera and stepped back from my desk, my stomach churning. I looked at the photo again, forcing myself to examine it closely. The hand was definitely there, unmistakable. And now that I looked more carefully, I could see other shapes in the dirt around me, the suggestion of other hands, other arms, pressing up from below. I checked the timestamp on the photo. It had been taken at 6:47 p.m., right around the time I'd heard the singing, right when I'd been kneeling in the clearing with my ear to the ground. But I hadn't taken it. I would have remembered. Someone or something else had taken that photo with my camera. I never went back to Yellow Dog Village. I couldn't. I deleted my notes, threw away my research, and started focusing on other projects, other ghost towns. Anything to avoid thinking about what I'd seen and heard that evening. But I can't escape it entirely. Because sometimes, late at night when my apartment is quiet, I hear it again. The singing, faint and distant, like it's coming from very far away. A hymn in harmony, men and women and children, their voices rising and falling in that same beautiful, terrible melody. And when I hear it, I remember the feel of the ground vibrating beneath my hands. I remember the figures standing in the shadows, watching. I remember that hand reaching up from the earth, fingers straining toward me. I've tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that grief and exhaustion and isolation had created a hallucination. But I still have that photograph. I keep it locked in a drawer now, hidden where I don't have to look at it. But I know it's there, proof that something happened in Yellow Dog Village that evening. Proof that I wasn't alone. The worst part is wondering what would have happened if I'd stayed. If I'd kept listening to that singing, kept my ear pressed to that vibrating ground. Would those hands have broken through? Would the figures have moved closer, stepped out of the shadows? Would I have joined them, one more voice in that eternal hymn? Sometimes I think I can still feel it, the pull of that place calling me back, like a song I can't quite remember, stuck in the back of my mind. And I know, deep down, that Yellow Dog Village isn't really abandoned. The people never left. They're still there, beneath the ground, singing their hymns and waiting for someone to listen, waiting for someone to join them. And I'm terrified that one day, I won't be able to resist. I'd been hiking sections of the Appalachian Trail for years, always looking for the quiet stretches where history and wilderness intersected. Rausch Gap was one of those places, a ghost village from the 1800s, abandoned when the coal mines ran dry and the railroad moved on. Now it was just ruins scattered through the forest, accessible only by a 6-mile hike along the trail. I'd wanted to visit for a while, and on a cool October afternoon, I finally made the trip with my dog, a German Shepherd mix named Copper. We started the hike around 2 in the afternoon. The trail was beautiful that time of year, the leaves turning brilliant shades of red and gold, the air crisp and clean. Copper trotted ahead of me, his tail wagging, stopping occasionally to investigate interesting smells along the path. We saw a few other hikers early on, exchanged the usual nods and brief greetings, but as we got deeper into the woods, we were alone. The ruins of Rausch Gap appeared gradually, almost organically, as if the forest had absorbed them. First, a pile of stone that might have been a chimney, then a rectangular depression that marked where a building had stood. The farther we walked, the more ruins we found, stone foundations half buried in leaves, collapsed walls covered in moss, the remains of a well with a rusted metal grate across its opening. I stopped to take photos, fascinated by the way nature had reclaimed everything. Trees grew up through the middle of foundations. Vines covered the old stone walls. In another 100 years, there would be nothing left to indicate that people had ever lived here at all. Copper had been fine at first, sniffing around the ruins with his usual curiosity. But when we reached the old well near what I assumed had been the center of the village, his behavior changed. He stopped several feet away from it, his body going rigid. The hackles on his neck rose, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" I asked, walking over to him. I looked around, trying to see what had spooked him, but there was nothing, just trees and ruins and the quiet rustle of leaves in the breeze. Copper's growl grew deeper. He was staring at the well, his ears pinned back, every muscle tense. I'd never seen him act like this before. He wasn't a nervous dog. He'd been hiking with me for years and had encountered bears, snakes, and all manner of wildlife without batting an eye. I walked over to the well to see if there was something inside that might be bothering him, a dead animal, maybe, or some other disturbance. I leaned over and peered through the rusted grate. The well was deep, disappearing into darkness, and I couldn't see the bottom. But I didn't smell anything foul, didn't see any obvious cause for Copper's distress. That's when I heard it. Music, a flute, playing a slow, mournful melody that echoed through the trees. The notes were clear and pure, rising and falling, in a tune that sounded old, like something from another century. I straightened up and looked around, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. There was no one on the trail, no other hikers, no houses, nothing but forest for miles. Yet the music continued, hauntingly beautiful and impossibly out of place. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding small in the vastness of the woods. "Is someone there?" The music didn't stop. If anything, it grew slightly louder, the melody weaving through the trees. It seemed to be coming from ahead of me, farther down the trail. I took a few steps in that direction, and the music moved with me, always staying just out of reach. Copper barked once, sharp and urgent, then turned and bolted back the way we'd come. I called after him, but he didn't stop, crashing through the underbrush and disappearing around a bend in the trail. "Copper, come back!" I shouted, my heart starting to pound. He never ran off like that, never. I started after him, jogging down the trail, calling his name. But I couldn't hear him anymore. All I could hear was the flute, that slow, mournful melody that seemed to follow me, no matter which direction I turned. The music was getting closer now, louder, the notes so clear I could almost feel them vibrating in my chest. I stopped running and spun around, and that's when I saw him. A man was standing on the trail behind me, maybe 30 feet away. He was wearing tattered clothes, old clothes, the kind you might see in a historical photograph. A worn jacket, pants that looked like they'd been patched a dozen times, boots that were little more than scraps of leather. His hair was long and matted, his face gaunt and shadowed, and he was holding something to his lips, a flute. He lowered it slowly, and we stared at each other across the distance. His eyes were dark and hollow, sunken deep into his skull. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at me with those empty eyes. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He raised the flute back to his lips and began to play. The sound was deafening. It wasn't music anymore. It was a shriek, a wail, something that pierced through my skull and made my teeth ache. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was inside my head, reverberating through my bones, drowning out everything else. I couldn't think. couldn't breathe. All I could do was feel that terrible, piercing sound tearing through me. I turned and ran. I crashed through the forest, not following the trail anymore, just running in whatever direction would take me away from that sound. Branches whipped at my face and tore at my clothes. I stumbled over roots and rocks, nearly fell a dozen times, but I kept running. The flute followed me, that unbearable sound echoing through the trees, chasing me through the woods. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't dare stop. Finally, when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst out of the forest and onto the trail near the parking area. My car was there, exactly where I'd left it, and sitting beside it, trembling and whimpering, was Copper. I ran to him and dropped to my knees, throwing my arms around his neck. He was shaking, his eyes wide with terror, but he was alive. We stayed there for a long moment, both of us catching our breath, and then I got him into the car and locked the doors. I sat in the driver's seat, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and looked back toward the trailhead. The forest was quiet now. No music, no figure in tattered clothes, just trees and shadows and the last light of the afternoon filtering through the leaves. I started the car and drove home, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the wheel straight. Copper sat in the passenger seat, pressed against the door, still trembling. Neither of us looked back. It wasn't until I got home and started to calm down that I noticed the pain in my arm. I rolled up my sleeve and found a deep scratch running from my elbow to my wrist, the skin torn and bleeding. I had no idea how I'd gotten it. I didn't remember hitting anything, didn't remember feeling any pain while I was running. But there it was, red and raw and throbbing. I cleaned it and bandaged it, telling myself I must have scraped it on a branch while I was fleeing through the forest. That was the logical explanation, the only explanation that made sense, but the scratch didn't heal the way it should have. Weeks later, it was still there, a raised red line on my arm that never quite faded. And sometimes, when I looked at it, I swore I could see the shape of fingers in the pattern of the scar. Like someone had grabbed me while I was running, like someone had marked me. I tried to go back to hiking after that, tried to recapture the peace I used to find on the trail, but I couldn't do it. Every time I stepped into the woods, I heard it faint and distant, but unmistakable. The flute, that slow, mournful melody echoing through the trees, always just out of sight but never quite gone. Copper never wanted to hike again. The moment I'd pull out my backpack, he'd retreat to the corner of the room and refuse to move. Whatever he'd seen or heard in those woods had broken something in him, and I couldn't blame him. I'd felt it too, that presence, that wrongness, the sense that we'd wandered into a place we were never meant to be. I did some research after that day, trying to find an explanation for what I'd experienced. I learned that Rausch Gap had been a rough place in its time, hard living, harder dying. Men worked the mines until they couldn't work anymore, then were buried in unmarked graves in the forest. The village had its share of violence, 2 murders, accidents, despair. When the mines closed, people left quickly, abandoning their dead to the wilderness. There were stories, if you knew where to look, stories about music in the woods, about a piper who wandered the ruins, playing for those who couldn't find their way home. Some said he was a miner who'd gone mad underground, driven insane by the darkness and the isolation. Others said he was something older, something that had been in those mountains long before the miners came. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know if it was a man or a memory or something else entirely. All I know is that I can still hear that flute sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. It drifts through my dreams, that slow, mournful melody, calling me back to those woods. And the scar on my arm, the one that never healed, the one that looks like fingers it aches when the music plays. Like whatever marked me in Rausch Gap isn't finished with me yet. Like it's waiting for me to come back. Sometimes I think about returning, about hiking that trail one more time to see if I can make sense of what happened. But then I look at Copper, still nervous and jumpy after all this time, and I remember the hollow eyes of that figure on the trail. I remember the sound of that flute, so loud it felt like my skull would split. And I know I'll never go back to Rausch Gap, because some places don't want to be remembered. Some places want to be left alone with their dead and their secrets. And if you're smart, you'll leave them be. But they won't always leave you be. That's the part I didn't understand until it was too late. The part that keeps me awake at night, listening for that melody in the darkness, wondering when it will come for me again. I came to Verum on a research trip, documenting the remains of Pennsylvania's abandoned coal towns for a book I was working on. Wareham had been a bustling company town in the early 1900s, with hundreds of miners and their families living in identical houses arranged in neat rows. The company owned everything: the houses, the store, even the school. When the coal ran out in the 1930s, the company pulled up stakes and left, and the town died within months. Most of the buildings were torn down or collapsed over the decades, leaving behind only scattered foundations and the stories of the people who once called this place home. I arrived on a gray November morning, the kind of day where the clouds hang low and the light never quite brightens. The access road to Wareham was barely passable, overgrown with weeds and pocked with holes that made my car bounce and groan. I parked at the end of what used to be the main street and got out, pulling my jacket tight against the cold wind. The site was more desolate than I'd expected. I'd seen photographs from the 50s and 60s showing partial buildings still standing, but now there was almost nothing left. Just foundations hidden beneath brambles and overgrown grass, the occasional pile of brick or timber that had once been someone's home. I walked slowly through the ruins, taking photographs and making notes, trying to piece together the layout of the town from the scraps that remained. I was looking for the company store specifically. Historical records indicated it had been the largest building in Wareham, a two-story structure that served as the commercial and social heart of the community. I'd hoped to find at least some remnant of it, a foundation, a sign, anything that would help me place it in the context of the town's geography. I spent hours searching, following overgrown paths that might have once been streets, pushing through underbrush and stumbling over hidden stones. But I found nothing, just rubble and rot and the overwhelming sense that nature had won, that it had erased every trace of human presence from this place. I was about to give up and head back to my car when I heard it. A bell. It was slow and rhythmic, the deep tolling sound of a church bell or a school bell. Each ring echoed through the trees, clear and resonant, cutting through the quiet afternoon. I stopped walking and listened, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It didn't make sense. There was no church in Wareham, the historical records were clear on that. The company hadn't built one, and the closest church would have been miles away in one of the neighboring towns. There had been a school, though. A one-room schoolhouse where the children of miners had learned their lessons before going down into the mines themselves. I pulled out my map and tried to orient myself. If I was reading it correctly, the school would have been to the north, in a clearing near the edge of the original town site. I started walking in that direction, following the sound of the bell. The ringing continued, steady and unchanging. Each toll seemed to pull me forward, drawing me deeper into the ruins. I pushed through a thick stand of trees and emerged into a clearing. The undergrowth was less dense here, and I could make out the rectangular depression where a building had once stood. This had to be the school. The bell rang again, louder now that I was closer. I looked around, trying to locate the source, and then I saw movement in the trees at the far edge of the clearing. A figure was standing there, partially obscured by branches. At first, I thought it was another researcher or maybe a local who'd come to explore the ruins. But as I watched, I saw that he was swinging something on a rope, a bell, suspended from a thick cord that he held above his head. He swung it in a slow, deliberate arc, and each time it reached the peak of its swing, it rang out with that deep, resonant tone. "Hello," I called out, raising my hand in greeting. "Are you with the Historical Society?" The figure stopped swinging the bell. He turned to face me, and that's when I got my first clear look at him. His face was wrong. That's the only way I can describe it. Too pale, almost luminous in the gray light, like it hadn't seen the sun in decades. His features were too still, too rigid, lacking the subtle movements that make a face human, the slight shifts of expression, the unconscious twitches and blinks. He stared at me with dark, empty eyes, and he didn't move, didn't breathe. Just stood there, holding that bell, staring. "I'm doing research on Wareham," I said, my voice suddenly uncertain. "I didn't mean to interrupt. I just heard the bell and wanted to see." He dropped the bell. It hit the ground with a dull thud, and he stepped toward me. There was something wrong with the way he moved. Too smooth, too deliberate, like each step was calculated. He didn't walk like a person. He walked like something pretending to be a person, something that had studied human movement, but couldn't quite replicate it. I backed away, my heart starting to pound. "I'm sorry," I said, though I didn't know what I was apologizing for. I'll leave you alone." He took another step forward, and then another. He was moving faster now, closing the distance between us with alarming speed. I turned and ran. I crashed back through the trees, branches whipping at my face and tearing at my clothes. Behind me, I could hear the bell ringing again, not the slow, rhythmic tolling from before, but frantic and desperate, each ring coming faster than the last. The sound chased me through the forest, growing louder and more insistent. I didn't know where I was running. I'd lost all sense of direction in my panic, and the overgrown paths all looked the same. I just knew I had to get away from that clearing, away from that figure with his too pale face and wrong movements. The bell rang and rang, so close now I could almost feel the vibrations in my chest. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw him there, maybe 20 feet behind me, moving through the trees with that same unnatural smoothness. He was still holding the bell, swinging it as he ran, each ring timed perfectly with his steps. I pushed myself harder, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. I stumbled over a hidden root and nearly fell, catching myself on a tree trunk at the last second. The bell was right behind me now, so loud it felt like it was inside my skull. And then, finally, I saw my car through the trees. I sprinted the last 50 yards and threw myself inside, slamming the door and locking it. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition, but I managed it and the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse and backed down the access road, not caring about the holes or the overgrown weeds. I just needed to get away. When I'd put some distance between myself and the ruins, I stopped and looked back toward the clearing. It was empty, no figure, no movement. The forest was perfectly still, and the only sound was my own ragged breathing and the idle of my engine. The bell was silent. I sat there for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But I could still hear the echo of that bell in my mind, could still see that pale, motionless face staring at me across the clearing. I put the car in drive and started down the road, eager to put as many miles between myself and Verum as possible. As I drove, I checked the rearview mirror compulsively, watching the road behind me. And that's when I saw him. He was standing in the middle of the road, maybe 100 yards back, just standing there, perfectly still, watching my car drive away. The bell was in his hand, hanging from that same rope, and as I watched, he raised his arm and swung it. Even through the closed windows, even over the sound of the engine, I heard it ring. One slow, deliberate toll that seemed to vibrate through the entire car. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and didn't look back again until I was on the highway, surrounded by traffic and civilization and things that made sense. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, still watching, still ringing that bell. I never went back to Wareham. I scrapped that chapter of my book and focused on other towns, other stories. I told myself it wasn't worth it, that there wasn't enough left of Wareham to make it interesting for readers. But that was a lie. I was afraid. I am afraid because sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the bell, slow and rhythmic, just like it was that day in the clearing. It's faint, almost imperceptible, but it's there, and each time I hear it, it's a little bit louder, a little bit closer. I've tried to convince myself it's just my imagination, just the memory of that day playing tricks on my mind. But then I'll be driving somewhere, lost in thought, and I'll catch a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A figure standing by the side of the road, pale and motionless, holding something in his hand, and the bell rings. I've started taking different routes, avoiding certain roads, certain areas. I've moved twice in the past year, trying to put distance between myself and whatever I encountered in Verum. But it doesn't matter. The bell still finds me. It rings in my dreams, in quiet moments when I'm alone, in the spaces between heartbeats. I think about that figure sometimes, about who he was or what he was. Was he a miner who died in those tunnels beneath Wareham, condemned to ring the warning bell for eternity? Was he something else? Something that had been in those mountains long before the coal company came? I don't know. I don't think I'll ever know. All I know is that I heard the bell, and now it won't stop ringing. And someday, I'm afraid I'll look in my rearview mirror and see him standing there, right behind my car, close enough to touch. The bell will be in his hand, swinging in that slow, deliberate arc. And when it rings, I think that will be the last thing I hear. My cousin Tommy called me in late August asking for help moving into a house he just bought in Vintondale, I hadn't heard of the place, but he explained it was a small town in western Pennsylvania that had been devastated by flooding back in the 70s. Most people had taken the government buyout and left, abandoning their homes to slow decay. Tommy had found a place online for almost nothing, a 2-story house that the listing described as needing some TLC but structurally sound. He was excited about it, talking about fixing it up and flipping it for a profit. I agreed to help, mostly because I owed him a favor and figured I could use a weekend away from the city. I drove out there on a Friday afternoon in early September. Vintondale was even more desolate than I'd imagined. The main street was lined with empty storefronts, their windows dark and dusty. Houses sat vacant, yards overgrown, porches sagging. There were a few signs of life, a corner store that looked like it might still be open, a church with a freshly mowed lawn, but mostly the town felt abandoned, like it was waiting for permission to finally collapse. Tommy's house was on a side street near the edge of town, backing up to a steep hillside covered in dense forest. It was a simple 2-story structure, with white siding that had faded to gray and a roof that looked newer than the rest of the building. Tommy was already there when I pulled up, his truck parked in the driveway, the back loaded with boxes and furniture. "What do you think?" he asked, grinning as I got out of my car. He looked proud, like he'd just shown me something valuable. "It's got character," I said diplomatically, looking at the peeling paint and crooked shutters. "It's a steal, that's what it is," Tommy said. "Place has good bones. Foundation's solid. Roof was replaced 5 years ago. Once I get some paint on the walls and fix up the floors, I'll be able to sell it for 3 times what I paid." We spent the afternoon unloading his truck and hauling boxes inside. The house was bigger than it looked from the outside, decent-sized rooms, high ceilings, hardwood floors that needed refinishing but were in surprisingly good shape. The walls were covered in ancient wallpaper, and everything smelled musty and damp, but Tommy was right about the bones. With some work, it could be a nice place. We'd just finished bringing in the last of the furniture when Tommy said, "Hey, we should check out the basement. Listing said there's a lot of storage space down there." I followed him to the kitchen, where a door I'd barely noticed was set into the floor near the corner. It was old wood, painted white at some point, but now chipped and stained. Tommy pulled it open, and we both peered down into the darkness below. The stairs were steep and narrow, disappearing into shadows that seemed to swallow the light from the kitchen. A cold draft came up from below, carrying the smell of earth and stone and something else. I couldn't quite identify something old and stagnant. "That's a hell of a draft," I said. Tommy nodded, pulling out his phone and turning on the flashlight. "Come on, let's take a look." I grabbed my own phone and followed him down. The stairs creaked under our weight, and I had to duck my head to avoid hitting the low ceiling. With each step, the temperature seemed to drop, and the smell grew stronger, damp earth and decay. When we reached the bottom, Tommy swept his light around the space. The basement was unfinished, just a large rectangular room with stone walls and a dirt floor packed hard from age. The ceiling was low, supported by rough wooden beams, and in the center of the floor was a single drain, a rusted metal grate covering a dark hole. "Creepy," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the enclosed space. Tommy laughed. "It's just old. Probably been here since the house was built." He walked around, shining his light on the walls. "Plenty of space, though. I could finish this, put down a concrete floor, make it a rec room or something." I was about to suggest we head back upstairs when Tommy stopped moving. His light was fixed on one section of the stone wall, and he was silent. "What?" I asked, walking over to him. He pointed at the wall. I leaned in and saw what he was looking at: words carved into the stone, the letters crude and irregular, like someone had scratched them there with a nail or a piece of metal. "Don't wake them." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" Tommy said, but he was smiling, treating it like a joke. "Previous owner trying to scare people?" I ran my hand over the carved letters. They were deep, cut into the stone with considerable effort. Whoever had made them had spent time on this, had wanted to make sure the message lasted. "Maybe it's about rats," I said, trying to sound casual. "Or, I don't know, could be anything." Tommy shrugged. "Probably just some kid messing around. Come on, let's grab some dinner. I'm starving." We went back upstairs, and Tommy closed the basement door. We drove into the next town over and found a diner, spent a couple hours eating and talking about his plans for the house. By the time we got back, it was after 10 and I was exhausted. Tommy had set up an air mattress for me in one of the upstairs bedrooms, and I collapsed onto it without bothering to unpack my overnight bag. I fell asleep quickly, but it didn't last. I woke suddenly, disoriented in the darkness. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was, and then it came back: Tommy's house, Vintondale, the empty streets. I checked my phone. Just after midnight. I was about to close my eyes again when I heard it. Scratching. It was faint at first. A soft scraping sound that seemed to be coming from below me, from somewhere on the first floor. I sat up, listening. The scratching continued, rhythmic and persistent, like nails on wood, or claws. I thought about waking Tommy, but his bedroom was on the other side of the house, and the sound wasn't that loud. Probably just an animal that had gotten inside, a raccoon or a stray cat. I'd dealt with raccoons before. They could be a pain to get rid of, but they weren't dangerous if you left them alone. I got up and made my way downstairs, using my phone's flashlight to navigate the dark hallway and stairs. The scratching was louder down here, more distinct, and it was definitely coming from below, from the basement. I walked to the kitchen and stood in front of the basement door, listening. The scratching had grown frantic now, faster and more urgent. It sounded like multiple sources, like several somethings were clawing at the dirt floor or the stone walls. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. I stood there in the darkness, my hand on the doorknob, my heart pounding. I should have gone back upstairs. I should have left it alone. But instead, I listened. That's when I heard the breathing. It was coming from the other side of the door, from down in the basement. Heavy, wet breathing, like someone with fluid in their lungs. Slow and labored, each breath rattling and wheezing. But it wasn't just one person breathing. It was multiple sources, overlapping, creating a chorus of ragged, struggling breaths. My hand was still on the doorknob. Before I could think about what I was doing, before I could talk myself out of it, I pulled the door open. There were no stairs. Where the steep, narrow staircase should have been, there was just a black pit. The darkness was absolute, swallowing the beam from my phone like it was nothing. I couldn't see the bottom, couldn't see the walls, just emptiness. And from that emptiness came the breathing, louder now, echoing up from the depths. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my hands shaking. I stood there in the kitchen, staring at the closed door, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. The stairs had been there. We'd gone down them just hours ago. Stairs didn't just disappear, but they had. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, watching the kitchen doorway, waiting for something to emerge. But nothing happened. The house was silent. And when the sun finally came up, I felt foolish, convinced I'd been dreaming or hallucinating from exhaustion. Tommy came downstairs around 7, looking well rested. "Morning," he said cheerfully. "Sleep okay?" I almost didn't tell him, almost convinced myself it had been a dream. But then I thought about those carved words in the basement wall. Don't wake them, and I knew I had to say something. "Tommy, something weird happened last night." I started, and I told him everything. The scratching, the breathing, the missing stairs. He listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from amusement to concern. "Let's check it out," he said when I finished. We went to the kitchen together, and Tommy opened the basement door. The stairs were there, steep and narrow, exactly as they'd been before, leading down into the darkness. "See?" Tommy said. "Probably just a weird dream, man. This place can mess with your head if you're not used to old houses." But I knew what I'd seen. I'd been awake. I'd opened that door and looked down into nothing. "Let's go down," I said. "I want to check something." Tommy nodded, and we descended the stairs together, our phones lighting the way. The basement looked the same as before: stone walls, dirt floor, that single drain in the center. But then Tommy's light swept across the floor, and we both froze. The dirt was covered in handprints, dozens of them, maybe more, scattered across the entire floor. Small handprints, like they'd been made by children. Some were clear and distinct, showing the shape of each finger. Others were smudged, as if whoever made them had been moving frantically. They were everywhere, on the floor, around the drain, against the walls. Even on the stairs, small palm prints pressed into the wood. Tommy knelt down and touched one of the prints. The dirt was still slightly damp, as if the prints had been made recently. "What the hell?" he whispered. I looked at the carved words on the wall. "Don't wake them." And I understood, finally, what they meant. Whoever had lived here before, Whoever had carved that warning had known. Something was down here. Something that shouldn't be disturbed. "We need to leave," I said, "right now." Tommy didn't argue. We went back upstairs and started loading his truck, working in silence. We didn't take everything, just the essentials, the things he couldn't afford to lose. We were in the truck and driving away within an hour. We didn't talk about it much after that. Tommy put the house back on the market immediately, selling it at a loss to the first person who made an offer. He never told the buyer what we'd seen, and I don't know if I would have either. Some things you just want to forget, but I can't forget, because sometimes late at night I hear it, the scratching, faint and distant, like it's coming from very far away. And beneath it, if I listen closely, I can hear the breathing, wet and labored and desperate. And I know deep down that whatever was in that basement is still there, still waiting in the dark, still scratching at the dirt, leaving those small handprints behind. The house still stands in Vintondale. I've checked. Someone lives there now, or at least someone owns it. I wonder if they've been down to the basement. I wonder if they've seen the handprints. I wonder if they've heard the scratching. And I wonder if they read the warning carved into the wall before it was too late. I'd been researching abandoned communities across Pennsylvania for years, but Elvira was different from the others. Most ghost towns died, slow deaths, mines closing, factories shutting down, people gradually drifting away. Elvira was erased. In 1940, the federal government decided they needed the land to build a munitions plant for the war effort. They gave the residents 6 months to leave, purchased their properties for a fraction of what they were worth, and bulldozed everything. Over 800 people displaced, their homes and churches and stores reduced to rubble. The munitions plant was never finished. After the war ended, the government just abandoned the site, leaving behind 1,000 acres of empty land slowly being reclaimed by the forest. I went there on a cool October morning, driving down narrow country roads until I found the unmarked dirt track that led into what used to be Elvira. There were no signs, no historical markers, nothing to indicate that a thriving community had existed here less than a century ago. Just dense Pennsylvania woods and the occasional glimpse of something man-made hiding beneath the undergrowth. I parked where the road became impassable and continued on foot, using an old map I'd found in the county archives to guide me. The map showed where the streets had been, where the houses and businesses had stood. But on the ground, it was almost impossible to match the neat grid of the map to the chaotic tangle of forest around me. I walked for about 20 minutes before I found the first remnant, a low stone wall half buried in leaves and moss, running for maybe 15 feet before disappearing into the earth. I knelt beside it and ran my hand over the stones, imagining the house that had once stood here, the family that had called this place home. How many generations had lived within these walls before the government came and told them to leave? As I explored deeper into the woods, I found more traces. A rusted piece of farm machinery, its purpose long forgotten, slowly being consumed by vines. A concrete foundation cracked and broken, young trees growing up through the middle. A ceramic doorknob lying in the dirt, its brass fittings green with age. Each artifact was a small piece of a larger story, a life interrupted and never resumed. I took photographs as I went, documenting everything I found. The forest was quiet except for the rustle of leaves and the occasional bird call. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It took me a while to identify what was bothering me. I felt watched. It was that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, that instinctive awareness that eyes are on you even when you can't see anyone. I stopped walking and turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and undergrowth, and the gray light filtering through the canopy. I told myself I was being paranoid, that isolation and the weight of history were playing tricks on my mind. I continued deeper into what the map indicated had been the town center. Here the remnants were more substantial, several stone foundations close together, the remains of what might have been a store or community building, a stretch of old road barely visible beneath decades of leaf litter. I was photographing a particularly well-preserved section of foundation when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 40 feet away, partially obscured by a large oak tree. An older woman, maybe in her 60s or 70s, wearing a simple dress that looked faded and old-fashioned. She was perfectly still, just standing there, watching me. I lowered my camera and raised my hand in a friendly wave. "Hello," I called out. I didn't know anyone else was out here. She didn't respond, didn't wave back, just stood there, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. I felt a flicker of unease but pushed it down. She was probably a descendant of someone who'd lived in Elvira, come back to visit the place where her family had once had a home. I'd met people like that before at other sites, people drawn back to the ruins of their family histories. "I'm just doing some historical research," I said, walking slowly toward her. "Documenting what's left of the town. Did your family live here?" She still didn't respond, but as I got closer, she took a step backward, moving deeper into the trees. I could see her more clearly now. Her dress was a faded floral pattern, the kind you might see in photographs from the 40s or 50s. Her face was lined and weathered, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She watched me with dark, unblinking eyes. "I'd love to talk to you if you have memories of this place," I said, following her. "Or if your parents or grandparents talked about what it was like before." She turned and walked into the forest, moving with surprising speed for someone her age. I followed, calling out to her, but she didn't acknowledge me. She just kept walking, always staying about 30 feet ahead, visible through the trees but never stopping. I should have turned back. Every instinct told me to return to the clearing, to my car, to anywhere but deeper into these woods. But I was curious, and maybe a little stubborn. I wanted to know who she was and why she was here. She led me away from the town center, into denser forest where the undergrowth was thick and tangled. I had to push through brambles and climb over fallen logs, but she seemed to glide through it all effortlessly, her faded dress never catching on branches, her feet making no sound on the forest floor. We walked for what felt like a long time, maybe 20 minutes or more. I was starting to get worried about finding my way back when she finally stopped. She was standing in a small clearing, surrounded by young trees and thick undergrowth. She raised one arm and pointed at the ground in front of her. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite explain. When I reached the spot where she was pointing, I looked down and saw it a grave marker, old and weathered, cracked down the middle and covered in moss. I knelt beside it and brushed away the debris that had accumulated over the years. The inscription was worn and difficult to read, but I could make out a name, Eleanor Pritchard, and below it, dates 1879 to 1941. I looked up at the woman, and my blood ran cold. She was staring down at me, still pointing at the grave. Her expression hadn't changed, that same blank, unreadable look, but now I understood what I was seeing in her eyes. It wasn't curiosity, or sadness, or any normal human emotion. It was nothing. An absolute emptiness, like looking into a void. I started to say, but the words died in my throat. She was gone. One moment she'd been standing right in front of me, close enough to touch. The next, the clearing was empty. I was alone with the cracked grave marker and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood up so fast I almost fell over. I spun in a circle, looking for her, but there was nothing. No sign of her, no sound of footsteps, no movement in the undergrowth. She had simply vanished. I ran. I crashed back through the forest, branches tearing at my clothes and face, my camera banging against my chest. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs threatened to give out, and then I kept running. But I couldn't find my way back. The forest looked the same in every direction, the same trees, the same undergrowth, the same gray light filtering through the canopy. I should have been able to retrace my steps, should have been able to find the clearing where I'd started. But every path I tried led me in circles, brought me back to places I'd already been. I wandered for hours, growing increasingly desperate. My phone had no signal, and the battery was dying. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, and the thought of being trapped in these woods after dark made my panic spike even higher. Just when I was starting to think I'd have to spend the night in the forest, I stumbled onto a dirt road. I recognized it immediately, the same road I'd driven in on that morning. I nearly cried with relief. I followed it back to my car and sat inside with the doors locked for a long time, just trying to calm down. I didn't look at the photos until I got home that night. I'd almost forgotten about them in my panic to get out of the woods. But when I finally uploaded them to my computer, I felt that cold dread settle back into my chest. She was in every single photograph, every one. In the first photos I'd taken that day, she was just a distant figure at the edge of the frame, barely visible among the trees. But as I clicked through the images, she got closer. In the shots of the stone wall, she was standing maybe 20 feet behind me. In the photos of the old machinery, she was closer still. By the time I got to the pictures I'd taken in the town center, She was right behind me in every frame, her face visible over my shoulder. And in every photo, she was pointing, not at the camera, but at something just off frame, always pointing. The last photo I'd taken was the one that made me slam the laptop shut. I didn't remember taking it. It must have been an accidental shot, the camera firing while I was running through the woods. But there it was. Her face filled the frame, so close to the camera that I could see every line and wrinkle, every detail of her gray eyes. She was smiling, not a warm smile or a friendly smile. It was something else, something predatory and knowing. And behind her, barely visible in the shadows, I could see them. Dozens of figures, standing among the trees, all wearing the same faded clothing, all with the same empty expressions, all pointing at me. I haven't been back to Alvira. I deleted all the photos except that last one, and I keep it locked in a password-protected folder I never open. But I can't delete the memory. I can't forget the feel of those woods, the weight of all those eyes watching me. I can't forget Eleanor Pritchard standing at the edge of the clearing, pointing at her own grave. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed, if I should have asked her what she wanted, what message she was trying to convey. But then I remember those empty eyes and that terrible smile, and I know that some questions are better left unasked. The worst part is the dreams. Several nights a week, I dream that I'm back in those woods, following that woman deeper and deeper into the forest. She leads me to that clearing, points at the grave, and when I look up, she's gone. But then I see them, all of them, standing in a circle around me. The displaced residents of Alvira, still wearing the clothes they died in, still standing in the ruins of their erased town. And in the dream, I realize I can't find my way out. I realize I'm going to wander those woods forever, just like they do, pointing at graves and empty foundations, trying to show someone, anyone, that we existed, that we were here, that we shouldn't be forgotten. I wake up in a cold sweat, and for a moment, I can still smell the damp earth and rotting leaves of that forest. And I wonder if someday I'll go back there, drawn by something I don't understand, and this time I won't find my way out. The town of Alvira is still there, hidden